those in our families and prior generations who didn't have the opportunities that I had and that the students here have today. How many more engineers we could have had in the 1940s or 50s or 60s, how many more scientists, how many discoveries could have been made, great things that could have happened right here in San Antonio and throughout South Texas. And part of the reason that it comes to mind for me is that of all the folks in my family, I'm not the most qualified to really speak to you about STEM issues. My dad, in 1963, graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with a mathematics degree. And you can imagine how many Latinos were at the University of Texas at Austin in 1963. My dad had actually started his college career at San Antonio College and transferred after a few years over to UT Austin. And fast forward now, 20 years later, 30 years later or so, I graduated from high school in 1992. And around that time, I want you to think back to 1992. You remember that there were still some rotary phones left around people's houses. If you took computer science in high school, you were still programming on Pascal or BASIC. Those are computer languages that are now long gone, right? And I remember that when I first went off to college at Stanford, I had only left home a handful of times. I'd only been outside of San Antonio a handful of times, and only on an airplane once or twice. And so I got to college in Palo Alto, California. It was already a hub of high technology, but in the coming years, in the decade of the 1990s, would really emerge as the national and international powerhouse for technology and STEM. And our first assignment when we got there was to register for classes. Well, you can imagine at Stanford University at that time, everything was on computers already. And I had taken computer science at Jefferson High School when I was a senior, but the computers that we had at Jefferson didn't have a mouse attached to them. And so I got in front of this computer at college, and I sat down in front of it with the course book, and I knew what I wanted to register for. And as I sat down, I couldn't make the cursor move on the screen. And I realized that you had to use the mouse to do it. So I never used a mouse before. I didn't know how it worked. Literally did not know how it worked. So I picked up the mouse and I started pushing the ball so it would roll. I was pushing the ball, trying to get it to move on the screen, and it moved a little bit. And then the girl next to me said, "Oh, you have to put it down and roll it." That was literally my first lesson in college. But it shows you the gap, even somebody that had been successful in high school. I graduated high school in 3 years. I took calculus. My dad was a mathematician, ended up being a math teacher for 31 years. The gap in experience between many of our students and the students that I was now coming to school with. That is the gap that all of us here seek to close. That is the gap that this Expo seeks to close. And I know that there are no more rotary phones. I know that now we've got Facebook and YouTube and Snapchat and Google and all of these wonderful companies, and our students are much more involved with technology, much more up to speed. In fact, when you look at mobile phone use, Hispanics are actually the biggest users, especially our young folks, of technology and of Facebook and other social media websites. That's a good thing. But we still have a lot of work to do. We still have a lot of work to make sure that we build our city into the place where people don't have to leave home to find the opportunities they want. I want you guys to tell me if you've heard this story. One of the blessings of this job is that I get to meet a lot of people. And one of the burdens sometimes is that I have to travel a lot of different places to do it. But over the years, over these many years now, I've met people from throughout the country who tell me a common story. I'll go somewhere and maybe speak somewhere, and afterwards somebody will come up to me and say, "Oh, I grew up in San Antonio. My family's still in San Antonio." And I ask them, "Well, why aren't you in San Antonio?" And they say, "Well, I graduated from high school there, and I went to college there, or I went to high school and then left for college, and I wanted to go home, but I can't find a job in the field that I graduated in." And more often than not, those graduates are the ones who graduated in STEM fields. As engineers, as chemists, as biochemists, all of these incredibly wonderful fields that we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that we find the jobs to match the talent and the potential of our students. And for years, the city struggled with this. You know, traditionally our city had been anchored in two economies. One was the tourism economy, the hospitality industry, which has been a wonderful industry for our city, right? San Antonio is the most visited city in the state of Texas. One of the most visited cities, you know, in the western part of the United States. So tourism and hospitality were one industry. The other one was our military. Once upon a time, everybody here knows that we had 5 military bases. This community was rocked, literally rocked, by the announcement in the 1990s, the Kelly Air Force Base, a base that had ushered thousands and thousands of families, many of them Hispanic families, into the middle class, was slated to close after a crackdown. And many of these events were eye-opening for us and really convinced our city leaders that we needed to broaden our economic sector. So now we've succeeded in large measure in doing that. Right now you have companies like Rackspace, you have Tesoro here, you have a Valero, you have Lockheed Martin, and you have Standard Aero and Boeing. And so there is a more diversified San Antonio economy, but we still have a long way to go to make sure that that story about somebody leaving is no longer true. And so in order to achieve that, in order to make sure that we have the jobs that our students will qualify for, and also in order to graduate more students who will go into these fields, because right now STEM jobs make up 20% of the U.S. economy, but Latinos only make up 8% of those who graduate with STEM degrees. So you can see the work that we have to do. And it's a few things. First, we have to start early. That's why I'm proud that in 2012, San Antonio decided not to wait for leaders in Washington or even in the state legislature in Austin and passed Pre-K4SA to give more of our students an early start and a successful career in school. Along with programs like PrEP, which Manny Bettis-Laval started so many years ago and Rudy has been so instrumental in developing, and many others, the Alamo Academies, which takes many of our students and puts them in careers and in jobs in aerospace and healthcare and other industries, that they have become a model not only for the state of Texas, but also for the nation. Just as Pre-K4SA started a debate all over the nation about the need for pre-kindergarten education and for full-day pre-kindergarten education. In fact, I looked at the newspaper, it must have been about a week ago, maybe a little bit less, and I saw a full-page ad by Raise Your Hand Texas saying half-day pre-K is not good enough for the state of Texas. So I ask all of you in the next legislative session, starting in January 2015, that you lend your voices to make sure that our state legislature does right by our kids, makes the proper investments, and funds full-day pre-K for all of the state of Texas. And once students get a strong start, we also have to make sure that they graduate from high school, go on to college, and graduate from college. You know, Eddie mentioned that I spent a lot of time in the legislature. I was vice chairman of the Higher Education Committee for 2 terms until I left to run for Congress. And during that time, I did a lot of work in making sure that we improve our college guidance system, right? What we have right now in terms of guidance for our students is really an anachronism. I don't know what your experience was, but I remember in my senior year of high school, there were a lot of caring teachers, principals, vice principals, administrators, and caring counselors. But the fact is, the whole year, I only saw my counselor twice. Once was to get my class rank, and once was to get P waivers to apply for college. So what we have oftentimes in our city is kids who are growing up in households with parents who never had the opportunity to go to college, and so they don't get the advice they need at home. And then in schools, we've not set up the proper guidance system to make sure that if they want to be an engineer or a computer scientist or even a political scientist, whatever it is that they want to do, that they get the proper guidance to go on into college and to graduate. And so the way I phrase it is, we always have to remember that there is a difference between being substantively ready, right, or being college ready, and actually helping push students into college or even into vocations. Those are 2 separate challenges that we face. There are important things that happen inside the school but outside the classroom. We always have to remember that. And when they do get to college, we need to make sure that they graduate. You know, in 2011, I remember, as y'all remember in the legislature, there was a big budget fight going on. And one of the biggest fights we had was over the fact that Texas Grants, which is the primary need-based scholarship in Texas, was only going to be funded that year at about 55%. This is not a merit-based scholarship. This is a need-based scholarship, right? For people of every race and ethnicity, for boys and girls, for people throughout the state. This need-based scholarship was only going to go to 55% of students who actually qualified for it. That means that about 45% of people who qualified based on need were not going to receive any Texas grant money. Now, I suspect in 2013, that percentage was probably increased, and we're doing better than 55%. But I assure you, we're not doing 100%, and we should be. We need to make sure that everybody who is qualified to receive this aid, who is a sharp student, has the best chance to go to college that they can possibly have with our support. And also, you know, Rudy mentioned making sure that UTSA becomes the next Tier 1 university. I absolutely agree. Texas has only about 3 national research universities. Rice University, Texas A&M, and UT Austin. New York has about 8 or 9, and no, actually New York has about 7. California has about 9. So you can see that as compared to our other competitors in other big states, we're way behind, and we need to do better by our students. All of this is to make sure that Texas is a place and San Antonio is a place that continues to lead the way in developing the emerging technologies and the emerging industries to make sure that the best talent that we grow here stays here, that it doesn't go somewhere else, that you don't hear those stories about somebody from San Antonio saying, I grew up in San Antonio 30 years ago and I hope to go back there when I retire. We want to make sure that they stay here and they have a job here, they can live their lives here. And finally, to the students that are here, I want to say thank you for participating in CORE4 STEM. And a quick story about why I've been so passionate about this issue. When I was in Stanford, and then I was at Harvard Law School for 3 years after I'd grown up on the west side of San Antonio. And around the time that my brother and I went to college, my mom had made about $20,000 or so that year or the year before. And she was trying to send 2 sons to college. And so I ended up with a lot of loans, some grants, and a lot of anxiety. And I was in my 5th year, I was in my 2nd year of law school, sitting in class in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And as I was sitting there, it was in the afternoon one day, and I was sitting there in a classroom of 30 or 40 students, and I finally slowed down for a minute, because I had always been in a hurry. Both my brother and I have always been in a hurry, as most people are when you're 18, 19, 21, 22. And I slowed down for a second and appreciated where I was, and how fortunate I had been. And as I slowed down and I looked around the room, I realized that I was sitting in class with some of the brightest students from all over the nation and different parts of the world. And as I listened to these people speak, I realized something that gave me a lot of hope, which was that the people speaking up in class that day were in many ways just like the people I went to school with at Jefferson High School, La Jolla Middle School, and Carvajal Elementary. Yet I was the only one from San Antonio, and probably the only Hispanic in that classroom that afternoon. And I realized that if you had put some of the people that I went to high school with at Jefferson High School in that classroom with us, they would have done just as well as I did, or better, and just as well as many of the other students in that class. And I suspect many of you who have gone into your careers now have a similar story to tell. And so I resolved back then that I would do every single thing that I could to make sure that everybody has a chance to live up to their potential. And to the students here, I want you guys to know that you have as much potential as anybody I ever sat in class with at Stanford University or at Harvard Law School. And that you have a city that loves you, that believes in you, that prays for you, that hopes for you. No matter where you end up, whether it's near or far, you'll always have a place to call home here in San Antonio. Thank you very much.